In the spring of 1901, a photograph appeared in the archives of the Westbrook County Historical Society in rural Pennsylvania that would become one of the most unsettling mysteries in early American medical history. The image depicts three identical infant girls arranged in matching christening gowns, their faces eerily similar, their poses unnaturally symmetrical. Beneath the photograph, written in careful Victorian script, reads a simple caption: "The Ashford Triplets, born March 14, 1901." The problem, as discovered by archivists decades later, is that according to every available birth record, hospital log, and census document from that year, Catherine Ashford gave birth to only two daughters on that date, not three, two. The third child in the photograph, according to official documentation, never existed at all. The story begins in the winter of 1900 in the small town of Milbrook, Pennsylvania, where Catherine Ashford, age 23, discovered she was expecting her first child. Catherine was the wife of Dr. Edmund Ashford, a respected physician who had established his practice in Milbrook after completing his medical training at the University of Pennsylvania. The Ashfords lived in a substantial Victorian home on the edge of town, a house that Edmund had inherited from his late uncle, also a physician. By all accounts, the pregnancy proceeded normally through the winter months. Catherine attended church regularly, corresponded with her sister in Philadelphia, and prepared the nursery with the help of their housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Greta Holbrook. In her letters, Catherine expressed both excitement and anxiety about impending motherhood, concerns that would have been entirely ordinary for a first-time expectant mother in the early 20th century. What makes the case peculiar begins in February of 1901, approximately 1 month before the birth. Mrs. Holbrook, in testimony given years later to a private investigator hired by Catherine's sister, recalled a dramatic change in the household dynamics. Dr. Ashford, who had previously been attentive and engaged with his wife's pregnancy, suddenly became withdrawn and secretive. He began spending long hours in his medical office, which was attached to the house through a connecting corridor that Catherine rarely entered. The housekeeper reported hearing strange sounds from the office late at night, sounds she described as mechanical whirring and the clink of glass instruments. When she inquired about these late-night activities, Dr. Ashford informed her that he was conducting important medical research that required privacy and concentration. He instructed both Catherine and Mrs. Holbrook to never enter his office without explicit permission, a rule he had never enforced before. On March 10, 1901, 4 days before the birth, something occurred that Mrs. Holbrook described as profoundly unsettling. She was cleaning the hallway near Dr. Ashford's office when she heard Catherine crying, not the gentle tears of pregnancy discomfort, but what the housekeeper described as the sound of absolute terror. When Mrs. Holbrook rushed to Catherine's bedroom, she found her mistress sitting on the edge of the bed, trembling, her hands pressed against her swollen abdomen. Catherine claimed that she had felt 3 distinct patterns of movement inside her womb, 3 separate rhythms, 3 individual presences. She insisted that she was carrying triplets, despite the fact that Dr. Ashford had examined her multiple times and assured her she was carrying twins. When the housekeeper suggested calling another physician for a second opinion, Catherine became frantic, insisting that Edmund would be furious if she questioned his medical judgment. Dr. Ashford, when informed of his wife's claims, dismissed them as the product of late pregnancy anxiety and prescribed her a sedative tonic of his own preparation. The birth itself occurred in the early morning hours of March 14, 1901, in the master bedroom of the Ashford home. Dr. Ashford insisted on delivering the babies himself, with only Mrs. Holbrook present to assist. No midwife was called, no additional medical professional consulted. This was unusual even for the period, as most physicians of means would have arranged for at least one colleague to be present for such a significant delivery, particularly given that twins were expected. The labor lasted 7 hours. Mrs. Holbrook's account of the delivery, recorded in her diary and later provided to investigators, describes a scene that grows increasingly strange as it progresses. She wrote that the first 2 infants were delivered normally, healthy identical girls with dark hair and strong cries. But after the second birth, Dr. Ashford did something that shocked the housekeeper. He instructed her to leave the room immediately, to go downstairs and prepare hot water and clean linens. tasks that she had already completed hours before. When she protested, he physically ushered her from the room and locked the door behind her. Mrs. Holbrook waited in the hallway for nearly 40 minutes. She could hear movement inside the bedroom, the sound of Catherine's exhausted voice, the cries of the two newborns, and other sounds she could not identify. She described hearing what sounded like cabinet doors opening and closing, and the rustling of heavy cloth or canvas. When Dr. Ashford finally opened the door, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool March morning, and his hands, though freshly washed, showed traces of what appeared to be something darker than blood beneath his fingernails. He announced that the delivery was complete, that mother and both daughters were healthy and resting. He instructed Mrs. Holbrook to clean the room but to disturb nothing in his medical bag, which sat closed on the dresser. The housekeeper noticed that the bag appeared fuller than it had been before the delivery, its leather sides bulging with contents that shifted when she accidentally brushed against it. The days following the birth proceeded with an almost theatrical normalcy. Dr. Ashford doted on his twin daughters, whom he and Catherine named Eleanor and Margaret. He showed them proudly to visitors, documented their weight and measurements with scientific precision, and seemed every bit the devoted father and skilled physician. Catherine, however, exhibited signs of what would have been described at the time as severe melancholia. She refused to nurse the infants, claiming that she could not bear to touch them. She wept constantly, stared out windows for hours, and repeatedly asked Mrs. Holbrook if she remembered hearing 3 babies cry during the delivery. The housekeeper, loyal to Dr. Ashford and perhaps frightened of the implications, insisted that she had heard only 2. But in her private diary, written in code that would not be deciphered until decades later, Mrs. Holbrook admitted that she believed she had heard 3 distinct infant cries coming from that locked bedroom. 3 separate voices in different pitches, all crying simultaneously before being reduced to 2. On April 2, 1901, exactly 19 days after the birth, the photograph was taken. Dr. Ashford had arranged for a professional photographer from the larger town of Harrisburg to come to the house to create formal portraits of the twins. The photographer, a man named Klaus Brenneman, who left behind extensive business records and correspondence, documented the session in his appointment book. His entry for that date reads, Ashford Residence, Milbrook. Portrait session, 3 infant subjects, unusual circumstances, fee paid in full plus additional compensation for discretion. The phrasing, 3 infant subjects, would become the central mystery of the entire case. Brenneman's records indicate he photographed 3 babies that day, yet the household officially contained only 2. When investigators attempted to interview Brenneman decades later, they discovered he had died in 1924. But his son recalled his father mentioning the strangest job I ever took, involving a doctor in a small town who had some kind of medical specimen that he wanted photographed alongside his daughters. The photograph itself reveals subtle details that only become apparent under close examination. The 3 infants are indeed nearly identical, arranged in a triangular composition on a velvet cushion. Eleanor and Margaret, the documented twins, are positioned on either side. The 3rd child, centered between them, shows certain peculiarities. While the outer 2 infants display the slight asymmetries natural to all human faces, the middle child possesses an almost perfect bilateral symmetry. The spacing between its eyes is precisely calibrated. The curve of its lips is mathematically even. Its skin appears smoother, less mottled than typical newborn skin. Most disturbing is the child's gaze. While Eleanor and Margaret look in slightly different directions as infants naturally do, the middle child stares directly at the camera with an intensity that seems impossible for a 19-day-old infant. Several analysts who examined the photograph decades later noted that the middle child's eyes reflect the camera flash differently than the outer 2, creating an effect described as glassy or artificial. Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly after the photograph was taken. On April 15, 1901, she attempted to leave the house in her nightgown during a rainstorm, claiming she needed to return the extra one. Mrs. Holbrook found her wandering in the garden, digging in the mud with her bare hands, searching for something she insisted was buried but not dead. Dr. Ashford had her confined to her bedroom and increased her sedative dosages. Her sister Elizabeth, who had been corresponding with Catherine regularly, became alarmed by the sudden cessation of letters and traveled from Philadelphia to investigate. When she arrived on April 20th, she was shocked by what she found. Catherine was barely coherent, heavily medicated, and kept under constant supervision. The twin girls appeared healthy and normal, but Elizabeth noticed something that Mrs. Holbrook had apparently been too frightened to mention. There were 3 cribs in the nursery, not 2. When she asked Dr. Ashford about the 3rd crib, he claimed it was simply an extra piece of furniture inherited with the house. Elizabeth's visit lasted 3 days, during which she attempted to gather information about her sister's condition. On the 2nd day, while Dr. Ashford was attending to patients in his office, Elizabeth managed to speak privately with Mrs. Holbrook. The housekeeper, perhaps sensing an ally or perhaps simply breaking under the strain of maintaining the household's secrets, told Elizabeth about the locked room delivery, the sounds she had heard, and the bulging medical bag. She also revealed that Dr. Ashford made frequent late-night trips to his office, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth, and that sometimes she heard sounds from that office that resembled infant cries, though muffled and somehow wrong in their cadence. Elizabeth demanded to see Dr. Ashford's medical office. He refused. When she threatened to involve local authorities, he became enraged, accused her of attempting to destroy his reputation with baseless hysteria, and ordered her to leave his home immediately. Elizabeth returned to Philadelphia, but began what would become a years-long campaign to investigate what had happened in that house. The truth, as Elizabeth eventually uncovered through tireless investigation and the careful cultivation of sources, was far stranger than she could have initially imagined. Dr. Edmund Ashford had not always been simply a country physician. Before establishing his practice in Milbrook, he had spent 2 years studying advanced techniques in embryology and anatomical preservation in Berlin, under the tutelage of Dr. Friedrich Merkel, a controversial figure in German medical circles who pushed the boundaries of acceptable research into human development and cellular manipulation. Ashford had returned to America abruptly in 1899, officially to care for his dying uncle. But letters discovered decades later suggest he had been asked to leave the German institution due to ethical violations involving his experimental procedures. What exactly those procedures entailed remained unclear, but references in correspondence mention artificial cultivation, cellular duplication, and anatomical modeling beyond mere preservation. In Milbrook, Dr. Ashford apparently continued his research in secret. His medical office, when it was finally examined after his death in 1907, contained equipment far beyond what would be necessary for a rural medical practice. There were glass cases filled with formaldehyde, sophisticated instruments for microscopy and cellular examination, and most disturbing, a series of detailed anatomical sketches depicting what appeared to be developmental stages of human embryonic tissue being manipulated and shaped. One set of sketches showed a progression from cellular material to what resembled a fully formed infant, with notes about structural reinforcement and external cultivation beyond natural gestation. The implications of these documents were so unsettling that the county medical board sealed them immediately, and they remained restricted for nearly 80 years. The theory that eventually emerged from Elizabeth's investigation, supported by Mrs. Holbrook's testimony and the physical evidence found in Ashford's office, suggests a possibility that challenges both medical understanding and moral imagination. The evidence indicates that when Catherine gave birth to her twin daughters, Dr. Ashford may have used biological material from that delivery to create a third entity, something that resembled an infant but was actually a constructed specimen, an attempt to artificially produce human life through medical manipulation rather than natural gestation. Whether this creation was intended as a scientific triumph, a grotesque experiment, or something more personal remains unknown. What is documented is that something existed in that house that resembled a third child, something that was photographed, something that required feeding and care, something that Dr. Ashford guarded with obsessive secrecy. The fate of this third presence is perhaps the darkest aspect of the entire mystery. On the night of May 3, 1901, exactly 50 days after the twins were born, a fire broke out in Dr. Ashford's medical office. The blaze was contained to that single room, but it burned with unusual intensity, hot enough to melt glass and warp metal instruments. Dr. Ashford claimed that chemicals used in his medical practice had accidentally ignited. Investigators found the explanation plausible enough, though the fire's timing raised questions. What was documented in the Wachai County Fire Marshal's report, however, was more disturbing than any suspicion of arson. Among the debris, firefighters discovered the remains of what appeared to be a small wooden crib, charred beyond recognition. Inside the crib were fragments of what the report described as anatomical materials of uncertain origin, organic matter that had been so thoroughly incinerated that identification proved impossible. The report noted that the materials showed signs of artificial preservation and structural reinforcement with wire or thin metal, phrases that make little sense in the context of a medical fire unless one considers what might have been kept in that crib. Catherine never recovered from her ordeal. She was eventually committed to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in Philadelphia in October of 1901, where she remained until her death in 1918. Medical records indicate she suffered from persistent delusions involving the number 3. She counted everything compulsively in threes, insisted on 3 portions of food, 3 blankets, 3 items of every kind. She repeatedly drew pictures of 3 identical faces arranged in triangular patterns. In her few documented coherent statements, she claimed that she had given birth to 3 daughters, but that Edmund took one back and that she could sometimes hear it crying from somewhere she could never reach. Her doctors diagnosed her with puerperal psychosis complicated by severe trauma, a diagnosis that allowed them to avoid examining the specifics of what she was claiming. Dr. Ashford continued his medical practice in Milbrook until 1907, maintaining his reputation as a skilled and dedicated physician. He raised Eleanor and Margaret as a widower, both girls growing into apparently normal, healthy young women. Neither daughter ever showed awareness of the mystery surrounding their birth, suggesting that whatever Catherine knew, she had been too incapacitated to share it with them. Dr. Ashford died in April 1907, officially of a heart attack, though some accounts suggest suicide. He was found in his medical office, which had been rebuilt after the fire, slumped over his desk with an empty bottle of morphine nearby. Among his papers was a letter addressed to no one, never sent, in which he wrote only, "The experiment succeeded beyond my intentions. I created what should not exist. May God forgive what science justified." The letter was sealed by the executor of his estate and remained unread until the 1970s. Eleanor and Margaret Ashford lived long lives, both marrying and having children of their own. Neither ever publicly discussed the circumstances of their birth or the photograph that hung in various family homes over the decades. The photograph itself passed through several owners, eventually being donated to the Westbrook County Historical Society in 1954 by a granddaughter who was clearing out a family estate. It was filed away as a curiosity, a Victorian family portrait of no particular significance, not until 1981 when a graduate student researching early American medical photography stumbled across it and noticed the discrepancy between the 3 children in the image and the historical records showing only 2 births, did the mystery begin to attract serious attention. Subsequent investigations, including interviews with descendants of the Ashford family, examination of Dr. Ashford's sealed papers, and analysis of Mrs. Holbrook's coded diary, revealed the full scope of the story. The photograph underwent forensic examination in 1985, using techniques unavailable in earlier decades. Analysts confirmed that the image had not been manipulated through double exposure or other photographic trickery common in the Victorian era. 3 distinct infants were present at the time the photograph was taken. Chemical analysis of the paper and emulsion confirmed the 1901 date. Digital enhancement of the image revealed additional unsettling details. Faint scarring on the middle child's scalp, consistent with surgical incisions, an unusual rigidity in its posture, suggesting some kind of internal support structure, and most disturbing, a reflection in its eyes that some analysts claimed showed not the photographer's camera, but rather a glass case or container, as though the child had spent significant time in enclosed observation. The case has generated numerous theories among medical historians, ethicists, and researchers of early American medicine. Some suggest that Dr. Ashford was attempting to push the boundaries of embryonic manipulation, perhaps trying to create a genetic duplicate of his twins using their biological material. Others propose that he was experimenting with advanced anatomical preservation techniques, creating what amounted to an extremely sophisticated medical model rather than a living being. More disturbing theories suggest that he may have been attempting something closer to what we would now call cloning or artificial gestation, using techniques that were scientifically impossible for the period, but which his obsessive research may have somehow approximated through methods we can only speculate about. What remains indisputable is that 3 infants appear in the photograph, only 2 appear in official records, and something existed in that house that Dr. Ashford was desperate to hide. The ethical implications extend beyond the specific horror of what Dr. Ashford may have created. His case represents an early example of medical experimentation conducted without oversight, accountability, or consent. Catherine's voice was silenced through medication and institutionalization, her testimony dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed woman when she may have been the most accurate witness to what occurred. The medical establishment of the period closed ranks around one of their own, sealing evidence and protecting Dr. Ashford's reputation, even as signs of his transgression mounted. The case illustrates how easily authority can be weaponized to suppress uncomfortable truths, and how the vulnerable can be silenced when their testimony challenges accepted narratives. The photograph remains in the Westbrook County Historical Society, displayed now with a placard explaining its controversial history. Visitors often report feeling unsettled by the image, particularly by the gaze of the middle child, which seems to follow observers across the room. Some claim the photograph produces unusual effects in the surrounding environment, causing electronic devices to malfunction or producing cold spots in the otherwise climate-controlled archive. These reports are almost certainly the product of suggestion and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness, yet they persist. What cannot be explained by psychology or suggestion is the physical evidence of Dr. Ashford's research, the testimony of multiple witnesses, and the undeniable presence of 3 children in a photograph documenting a family that, according to all official records, contained only 2. The mystery invites broader contemplation about the nature of life, creation, and the limits of human ambition. Dr. Ashford was operating at a time when medical science was rapidly advancing, when new technologies were making previously impossible interventions suddenly feasible. He was trained in an era that emphasized empirical experimentation over ethical restraint, when the pursuit of knowledge was considered justification enough for almost any methodology. If he did manage to create something resembling human life through artificial means, using techniques that were crude by modern standards but advanced for his time, what exactly had he created? Was it alive in the meaningful sense, capable of consciousness and experience? Or was it merely a sophisticated imitation, a biological automaton programmed to simulate life without truly possessing it? These questions remain unanswerable, buried with Dr. Ashford and the secrets he took to his grave. The legacy of the Ashford case extends into contemporary debates about reproductive technology, genetic manipulation, and the ethical boundaries of medical research. In an age when cloning, artificial wombs, and genetic engineering are no longer science fiction, but approaching reality, the cautionary tale of Dr. Edmund Ashford feels disturbingly relevant. His apparent attempt to transcend natural biological limits, to create life through artificial means, to play God in his isolated medical office, resulted not in triumph, but in tragedy. His wife was destroyed, his creation burned, his reputation ultimately reduced to a footnote in the history of medical ethics violations. Yet the photograph remains, 3 identical faces staring out from 1901, one of them officially non-existent, all of them disturbingly real. Modern descendants of the Ashford family have expressed mixed feelings about the renewed attention to their ancestor's story. Some view Dr. Ashford as a tragic figure, a brilliant mind corrupted by ambition and isolation, a man who crossed ethical lines but did so in pursuit of scientific understanding. Others see him as a monster, a man who treated his own wife as an experimental subject, who created and then destroyed something that may have been sentient, who placed his scientific curiosity above all moral consideration. The truth likely encompasses both perspectives, recognizing that human beings are capable of containing contradictions, of being both brilliant and cruel, both innovative and monstrous. Dr. Ashford was a product of his time, Yet his actions transcend temporal context, speaking to eternal questions about what it means to create, to destroy, and to live with the consequences of our choices. The photograph of the Ashford Triplets, only two of whom were ever born, stands as a testament to mysteries that resist resolution. Despite decades of investigation, analysis, and speculation, fundamental questions remain unanswered. What exactly existed in that Victorian house in the spring of 1901? What techniques did Dr. Ashford employ in his sealed medical office? What became of the third child after the fire? And did it ever possess consciousness, suffering, or awareness of its impossible existence? These questions hover around the image, creating a space where history blurs into speculation, where documented fact gives way to unsettling possibility. The photograph forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge and the persistence of mystery, even in an age that assumes all secrets can eventually be uncovered. Some mysteries deepen rather than resolve with investigation, becoming more complex and disturbing the more we learn. The case of the Ashford Triplets is such a mystery, an enigma that challenges our understanding while refusing to yield its ultimate truths, leaving us to contemplate three identical faces from more than a century ago, two documented, one impossible, all three undeniably real in the frozen moment of that photograph's creation.